the one question I'm asking is, at what point does the public just become numb to it and then can move on? But unfortunately for Canada, and I say this for Canada, Donald Trump doesn't stop. Every time that a commentator says, "Oh, that speech was, a snooze fest," I think there's an audience out there that says, "Thank you. I'm looking for boring now." An election can be like a job interview, and I think in the last 6 weeks, the job has changed that we're hiring the next prime minister for.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Sabrina Maddeaux.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
Today, we're talking about the latest trends and controversies in Canadian political polling, where things are changing at light speed, with Abacus Data CEO David Coletto.
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
Hi, David, and welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Sabrina. Good to see you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
So for well over a year now, the outcome of the next federal election has been all but guaranteed according to the polls anyways. Conservatives were supposed to win and very likely with a majority. But since January, polls have shown a huge shift, well, to varying degrees, but with the headline being the same. Liberals actually appear to have a shot at this. 3 major events have occurred in this time. Of course, we have Justin Trudeau's exit, Mark Carney's rise, and Trump's threats. Now, is one of these in particular driving the change, or is it more of a perfect storm? And is all of this a fleeting moment or a real lasting trend?
Yeah, well, lots there. Let me start by saying I think that Trudeau resigning, Trump doing what he's done, and then the Liberal leadership race. I think the Liberal leadership race probably isn't the one that was required, but I do think the other two were. I think Trudeau stepping away allowed a lot of Canadians to get past their dislike of him, and he was basically this barrier that was preventing a lot of people from even being open to voting Liberal. And then Donald Trump and what he has done since, he not only just won the election, but since his inauguration, and he started actually doing and not doing, and then doing and not doing things, I think has reset or redefined the environment and the choice that I think a lot of Canadians are thinking about. So I think both those first two had to happen, and then having a leadership race happening at the same time, in which you had a new individual emerge as both Liberal leader and prime minister, created an environment where people were looking more closely at the Liberals, I think, and Mr. Carney in particular, than they would have otherwise done. So the three together, I think, help create the environment and the situation we have. But you really needed Trudeau to step out of the way and for Trump to create the disruption that he has, in order to see the speed at which change has happened. And Sabrina, to your point, Abacus polls have been a little bit more bullish for the Conservatives than some of the others, but we have still seen a rapid and substantial shift in that public mindset, where the Liberals were at 20 points at the end of December. Today, we have them at 34. So a 14-point change in the horse race is, outside of an election. Again, it's you can point to the 93, the lead up to the 93 election with Kim Campbell or John Turner, those sort of historic examples. But beyond those, it's really, really a remarkable thing to see.
So you mentioned Kim Campbell, and a lot of Conservatives are wanting to point to that example right now. Is this just some sort of dead cat bounce, or is this here to stay?
I think it's hard to say. I think there's evidence to say, again, looking at the past, that this could be a fleeting moment for the Liberals. This new shiny thing. I'm going to look at that and I'm going to tell people like me, pollsters, that I'm going to vote the way I might have under normal circumstances if the world was a vacuum and I just typically vote the way I have. But on the other hand, so there's likely that could happen. On the other hand, I think in 93, even in John Turner's case in 84, you didn't have this existential threat that was sort of looming over domestic politics in Canada, being Trump. And so I think it's hard to say exactly whether we should expect, the Liberals and Carney to come back to earth, or whether it's because of that he's got a new place in order to, despite his perhaps faults, still be in a place to win a fourth mandate for the Liberals.
So what demographics are shifting over more? Is it kind of across the board? Is it more younger people, older people? What do we know about the Liberals' kind of rise from what the high teens or whatever they're at into the mid 30s?
I mean, we've seen an across the board increase for the Liberals, but I think the early movement that I saw was really much more concentrated among older Canadians, particularly baby boomers. And I think, you dig into below the horse race, and there's a good reason why that was happening, that, boomers, particularly those, I would say, over 50, which includes Gen X, we're paying more attention to the Trump chaos, I'm going to call it. They were far more likely to say they were angry, feeling betrayed, even signaling that they were going to, boycott everything American. And so that, I think, created the condition for the Liberals to engage, maybe without even trying, a demographic that has been hardest for them to engage over the last 10 years, which are those older voters. So I do think and I wrote a piece that I basically said, okay, boomer, you're now the saviors to the Liberal Party, which is a complete 180 from what we understood Canadian politics to have been over the last decade.
So we've talked about a couple events driving voting intent, but let's talk about changes in mindset. So you published some very interesting data recently suggesting that Canadians' scarcity mindset, which was primarily focused on being able to afford things like groceries and housing, of course, is shifting to what you called a precarity mindset. And that could actually change how people vote. Can you explain what exactly you mean by precarity mindset and also how it could upend the next election?
Yeah. So again, for over 2 years, we were seeing this idea that and we saw it in behavior or outside of politics, where the scarcity of a lot of things, whether it's housing, whether it's healthcare, whether it's just the general cost of living, was causing people to not only feel that the incumbent government, wherever that government is in part to blame for that scarcity, but also it drives people to kind of some zero-sum thinking. It's me versus others. It's very individualist. I think what we've seen emerge because of Trump is this shift in mindset where, and I describe it, and my colleague Eddie Shepard on our team came up with the term, so I'm going to give him credit for it, called precarity, and that it's bigger than just my ability to take care of my material needs. It's a deep anxiety really about the future, about whether Canada is going to exist or not, whether an issue like climate change is going to make life impossible, or where I live is going to be in constant threat, or that technological change and the way the economy is changing as a result is making me uncertain about my own job security. So that sense of precarity is much more about uncertainty. It's a much more deeper, I think, concern that requires and creates a demand for different type of leadership, right? Where a scarcity mindset is all about solving for scarcity. So I think, for example, Pierre Poilievre, build more homes, get rid of the carbon tax, deal with crime. Those are all things that I think speak directly to that mindset. In this environment, precarity is solved by a sense of security, right? Who's going to help guide me, my family, the country through it? And I think it moves more people away from that zero-sum thinking, right, where it's me versus you, to us versus them. And so that collective experience becomes more important. And I think, frankly, Liberals generally are better placed there. And Mark Carney and his resume, at least for now, may be more appealing to people who have that kind of mindset.
Mhm. Now, just to drill down a bit on that, what specifically is it about the Liberals and Carney that make them better placed to succeed in this new mindset? And where are the Conservatives lacking in that area?
Well, I think we released some research over the weekend that tried to delve into it, right? And there is a sense, even if people don't really know Mark Carney well, close to 70% of Canadians believe that he knows how to run an economy, that he has navigated maybe not an entire country, but a large part of it through previous crises that if I was Mark Carney, I would say I have spent my entire life preparing for this moment. And that is in sharp contrast, I think, to Pierre Poilievre, who, while has a lot of experience in politics, may never have been in a leadership role to have done this kind of thing. And so, it went from basically being that most people pointed the finger at liberals and in particular Justin Trudeau and said, I am feeling that the things in my life are more scarce because of choices you made and your government made over the last 10 years, to one now where people are willing to look past that and say, well, maybe you're the one who's going to provide the security and the calm and the stability that I'm actually looking for. So in a very short order, we went from almost everybody wanting change and significant change away from the Liberals to strangely more and more people now saying, well, maybe, I don't love all the policies. And that's why I think you've seen Carney move on day one to get rid of the carbon price. And, we'll see what he does on capital gains. But some of those unpopular things he's trying to shed while still keeping that air of stability and calmness that I think he projects so easily because he isn't exciting and dynamic. He is what he is, and I think in a weird way that's a perfect moment for him to display those kinds of characteristics.
Maybe a little boring, but boring is stable.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think every time that a commentator says, "Oh, that speech was a snooze fest," I think there's an audience out there that says, "Thank you. I'm looking for boring now. Enough of this constant perma-crisis events that just get my anxiety levels up every time I hear something about it."
Yeah, the old Bill Davis, bland works. I definitely think there's an appetite for that. So, so far the three of us have all been talking about this kind of red-blue race, this liberal conservative race. But, looking into your polling, there's another big phenomenon going on, and that's the collapse of the NDP. Your polling shows them in deep trouble. They've gone from about 18 to 20 down to the mid to low teens. So first of all, what's going on there? And secondly, do they have a potential to get back up to 18, 20, or, we looking at election night, them somewhere in the 10 to 14 range?
Yeah, well, and there's some polls just out in the last few days that has them in like single digits. So, there's a little bit of noise out there on how tough it is for the NDP, but it is bad. And I think what's fundamentally happening, and we've seen this in other jurisdictions, is at a moment of kind of crisis, there can be a tendency for people to kind of gravitate towards, one choice. And if there's two primary choices, then they can often consolidate, right? And we saw that in the UK, in the 27 general election in the UK after Brexit, right? It was the first time in a really long time that the two main parties, Labour and the Conservatives, got a larger share of the combined vote than they had seen previously. And since then, it's kind of disaggregated. But at that moment, you saw that kind of that consolidation. It really shows up in one question we asked, though, in our survey. Well, two questions. We first asked, here's a long list. What are the top three issues that you think are most important? And we have, for the past 3 months, started asking Donald Trump and his administration as an option. And it has spiked right up to number 2. So 50% of Canadians in our last survey said that would be one of their top 3 issues. It's up 24 points, I think, in a month. Cost of living is still number 1, but it's now only 11-point gap between those two issues. But we follow up and we ask those 50%, okay, which party do you think is best able to handle it? And the Liberals are ahead of the Conservatives by about 12 points on that, but the NDP only gets 8% of those who say Trump is a top issue, thinking that they are the best party to deal with it. And so I think for the New Democrats, it's relevance. It's, why am I in this conversation? Why would people choose us and Jagmeet Singh in particular over the other two when that dynamic has become very clear? If this next federal election, if it comes in the next few weeks, is about Trump, fundamentally, I think they're in deep, deep trouble. They need this election to be about something else, about affordability, about, corporate greed, about those usual kinds of issues that social democrats and New Democrats often can play into. And Mark Carney actually gives them a space for that. If I saw their new ad, and I thought it was kind of effective at making the case that, decisions he's made as a board chair, for example, weren't in the best interest of people. They were in the best interest of billionaires. What we can argue that was his fiduciary responsibility, but the point is the perception of that is powerful. So in an environment where that is not on people's minds, I think it's very easy for both the New Democrats, even the Bloc, to get completely squeezed out of the conversation and it just become a binary choice for people.
Oh, that's wild. That only 8% of Canadians see the NDP best positioned to deal with Trump. Because I don't know if I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I don't think this Trump issue is going to go away or diminish anytime soon. But if we look at the NDP, let's go back to the Ontario election of a few weeks ago. That the polls largely got the NDP's vote share right, including your polls. But seat projection models dramatically underestimated the number of seats they'd win. Because what happened was the party lost most of their votes in areas where they weren't competitive, places like rural southwestern Ontario. But their incumbents did quite well. And my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the power of incumbency was your doctoral thesis. So some questions about, I always, as someone with a PhD as well, I always like to ask people about their doctoral thesis. But, can you explain broadly, first of all, how these projection models work that take polling data and turn them into seat level predictions? And do you think there's a chance that we might see something similar from the NDP this election, where they finish at, say, 12 or 13, but they manage to hang on to all of their seats because the places where they see their vote collapse are, places like the 905, which are probably not winning anyway?
So, first on the seat models, the ones that we're probably most familiar with, like the Eric Grenier's and 338 Canada. My understanding is they try to take into account some local factors, but they're mostly, looking at the average change or swing between one party to the next, and they apply it on a regional basis. And so they aren't super well designed to capture that effect that you just described, Mike, that idea that like an incumbent can bring something unique to that particular election that buffets or changes the trajectory we would otherwise see. And in the research I did, and it was a while ago now, I looked at the 2004, 2006, and 2008 federal elections when I wrote my doctoral thesis, and it basically concluded that an incumbent on average in those elections could hold about 8 to 9 points more than if that incumbent wasn't there. So incumbency, that's a significant effect if it's a close race, right? And so for the New Democrats federally, having incumbents reoffering is actually really important at a time when their vote seems to be headed in the opposite direction. And so, you could say there's absolutely a hypothesis to say that they should be able to do better than they would otherwise do. And there's evidence even in the by-election held in Manitoba last year that the NDP held, despite what some thought the swing would have suggested the Conservatives should have picked that seat up in Elmwood Transcona, a riding, just in the vicinity of Winnipeg. Now, I think, and I don't know the exact number, but there are several New Democrat MPs not reoffering. I think of Charlie Angus as a perfect example in a riding in Northwest or Northern Ontario around Timmins. That is, at least in normal circumstances, prior to the Trump effect, the Conservatives had that on their target list, and they probably would have won it, and they probably still could win it without Charlie Angus, a long-time incumbent. I think he's been an MP there for over 20 years. They automatically lose that 10 points. So that personal vote that an MP, if they're a good MP, if they've done the work, if they've built the relationships, can build. So I think there's a chance the NDP can hold some of those seats. But, there's also evidence that no matter what, I think back to another NDP example, the 2011 federal election, in which in Quebec, you had candidates who have almost no, what I termed in an academic sense, quality. Like you had people, from McGill, students from McGill being placed in random ridings, and they're winning and beating incumbent Bloc MPs and conservative MPs like Lawrence Cannon, for example, the foreign minister in a riding just outside Gatineau, Quebec, was swept away by the orange wave. So it can work, and it can be a buffer to a wave, but sometimes that wave is just too big. It breaks through even the incumbency, what I'll call the incumbency barrier.
Now, you mentioned Quebec, and I want to talk about that a little bit because there's interesting things happening there right now where there's real tussle between the Liberals, Conservatives, and the Bloc that could actually decide the election. How do you handle regional nuances like that, and how do you ultimately see that battle play it out? And are current polls underestimating the Bloc's resilience?
Mm. I don't know. I think some interesting data points to chew on, right? Right after Donald Trump put in his first version of his tariff threats. It's terrorizing, but it's terror threats. It's almost, I guess, a type of terrorism. Anyways, for another conversation, Leger came out with a poll that showed within a few days, support for independence dropped by like 12 points in Quebec, particularly among Francophone Quebecers, which is usually where you see the strongest support for independence and that sort of Quebec nationalism. I think what this moment has done is it even erased some of those historic grievances or orientations of some Quebecers to say, well, right now maybe a united Canada and a strong Canada is needed to face the Trump factor. So, in our most recent survey, we have the Liberals now ahead by 7 points in Quebec at 37, with the Bloc at 30. And so there is indications that the Liberal vote, again, has reconstituted itself. The Bloc is still holding a substantial support. And the Conservatives, have fallen back to some of the highs we saw in Quebec. But the Conservative vote, to understand Quebec, is also to recognize it's highly concentrated around Quebec City. And so, it is almost impossible under any circumstance for the Conservatives to win a seat in Montreal or around Montreal. But they're going to likely hold a lot of those seats that they have now and maybe pick up one or two. So the real fight is in that north and south shore of Montreal, where you've got lots of Francophone voters who have swung, from the Bloc to the New Democrats, but have never really played with the Liberals, right? It's going to be a fascinating election, but those are what, Sabrina, you raise a really good point about a region where we should be watching carefully, because I think, again, conventional wisdom would say that Mark Carney, someone who doesn't speak particularly good French, who is not from anywhere near Quebec, should not play in that province. But we have, and so the Bloc, being the only party that would have a leader from Quebec, would be able to articulate a distinctly Quebec-focused narrative, should be able to compete in that environment. But again, it's not a normal environment in that way. And so Trump, again, has created a space where Liberals can speak to Quebecers in parts of the province they probably wouldn't have been able to and shouldn't be normally able to with Mark Carney as their leader.
Strange times indeed.
Yeah.
Now, one of the big question marks when it comes to polling and elections are always undecided voters and turnout. So how do you actually adjust for these? And we've seen some really dismal turnout in recent elections, like Ontario's. Do you see any indications that we'll see similar trends for a federal election, and how much impact could that have?
Yeah, so turnout is always the hardest thing for pollsters to try to gauge, because everyone over-reports not only did they vote in the past, but also their intent to vote. Right? Nobody really wants to admit, look, I'm not interested. And so I think turnout could matter. One of the things I'm watching for, though, is whether this election, because it could be a mix of both a change election and the Trump effect, I suspect we're going to see more interest in it than we would have seen in the last two federal elections. It's going to probably be more like 2015 than 2021. And that means, turnout models matter less if we do get close to maybe 65, 70% of Canadian eligible to vote actually turning out. But yeah, it's a constant challenge for pollsters like me to sort of say which version of our numbers is going to best reflect the electorate that we think is actually going to show up on election day.
So we're recording this. It's about 10:30 in the morning on Monday, March 17th, and that's relevant, I think, because this is changing so often. Um, so how do you see the next few weeks playing out? When do you think there might be an election call? Any idea what the election date will be? And then any predictions on how all of this is going to play out?
So it does appear already that what Mark Carney's trying to do is demonstrate he can be prime minister. So he's in Europe right now, meeting with allies, and then he's going to, I think, go to Nunavut and meet the premier of that territory to again signal a priority of the North and security and those kinds of things. I suspect, and all the rumors and intel that I've gathered suggests we'll be in an election next week. I think I just can't imagine, unless the circumstance requires it, for the Liberals and Mark Carney to want the House of Commons to come back. He does not have a seat in either house. I don't think that's ever happened where the House has been sitting and the Prime Minister has not been in either one of the chambers. And so it just, I think, would create a visual and a narrative that I don't think they want. I think, by all intents, they've got momentum right now. The polls continue to move in their favor. The public is open-minded. And so if you're Mark Carney, if I'm advising Mark Carney based on my numbers, and I'm not, but if I was, I would say, I think this is the time to go. I think it doesn't get much better for you in this environment. And again, I love comparative politics. So I think back to Gordon Brown. If anyone watching or listening, remembers Gordon Brown becoming prime minister after the Tony Blair years. Now, different in that he had been chancellor and been in that government for years, but he helped guide the UK and much of the world through that financial crisis, and then had that opportunity to call an election and didn't. And I think most observers suggest that had he called it then, he and the Labour Party would have done better. Maybe they wouldn't have won, but they would have done better than they ultimately did by delaying until 2010 and then losing government to David Cameron. So if Mark Carney's time in the UK has sort of given him that sense of history, he's also probably thinking this is the moment to go. And you want to control the narrative, you want to control the call, and not let the opposition parties determine when that election happens.
So assuming that happens, are we looking end of April, early May, noting that the election has to be on a Monday due to Canadian election law?
Yeah, and I think April 21st is Easter Monday. It's a federal holiday. It doesn't happen in every province. So yeah, I would say late April, early May. Again, I think, if I was thinking about the strategy, I don't want a long campaign. I want this to be tight and clear. I want the specter of maybe tariffs in early April again to be front and center as people make that choice. So I am planning my own business and my own schedule around the idea that I'm going to be really busy for the next 6 weeks, because I think we'll be in an election.
Mm-hmm. Beyond timing, I'm also curious if you have a prediction. Will there be any underappreciated or background issues that may have a larger impact than anyone thinks right now? Anything bubbling under the surface?
I don't see anything, right? I see the thing that's bubbling. It's not just bubbling. It's like it's boiling over, is this Trump issue. And I guess the one question I'm asking is, at what point does the public just become numb to it and then can move on? But unfortunately for Canada, and I say this for Canada, Donald Trump doesn't stop. He doesn't, even this past weekend, he's doubling down on, Canada being would be greater under him, the arbitrariness of our border. Like he keeps digging into that and adding to that precarity mindset that we talked about earlier. So I just feel like that is going to be the thing. And now that Mark Carney has, at least for now, stopped the increase to the carbon price on April 1st, that won't be a moment that reminds people of a Liberal policy that's perceived to be making their life more expensive.
It will not be a carbon tax election. Sorry,
yeah,
Pierre.
and I don't think so, right? And I think it could very well be an affordability election. And the carbon tax has been used so effectively by the Conservatives over the last few years as a proxy for that. But even though more people still put the cost of living high up on that list, even among those who put it as a top issue, when we look at then how that group might vote, the Liberals are tied with the Conservatives. So even that issue isn't defining the choice that people are making. It's still very much about responding to this crisis. And we asked a question on our last survey, between Poilievre and Carney, who do you think is best to do a bunch of things? But it wasn't like policy related. It was like, navigating a ship through a rough storm. And that to me is the metaphor of the moment. And on that question, Carney was ahead by Poilievre by, I think, 1 point or 1 or 2 points. They're basically tied. So I'm going to be watching that question, because I think in this current environment, that's really what people are judging these leaders on. And to take a line from Scott Reed from another podcast, an election can be like a job interview. And I think in the last 6 weeks, the job has changed that we're hiring the next prime minister for.
That's a perfect way of putting it. Well, I think we're all going to be very busy over the next weeks and couple months, so we'll be watching closely. Thank you so much, David, for coming on and for all your insights. And thank you to our audience for watching and listening, and to our producer, Meredith Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That was fantastic. And to our audience, if you have any thoughts or questions about doctoral theses, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
If only 5 of you read it, that will double the number probably who have already. So thanks.
And that includes the committee.
Yes.
Every reader counts. And we'll see everyone next time.